Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Over the past 1 month, tensions have been developing between India and China along the line of actual control, or the LAC. Reports about China transgressing onto the Indian side have dominated the news cycle. China's motives have been questioned, and there have been fears about what might happen between the two nuclear-armed neighbors. In this episode, we take a deep dive into this issue to understand how and when these tensions began, what could be the possible reasons for these transgressions, how the two countries are dealing with it now, and what is the way forward for them. Let's first take a look at when these tensions started.
So the first reports of these tensions came in early May.
That's Sushant Singh, Indian Express's deputy editor. He reports on defense for the newspaper.
When there was a Chinese patrol which crossed over from Nakula in Sikkim on the Indian side of the LAC, and a clash took place between Indian and Chinese soldiers. This was on 9th of May. Around the same time, reports started coming in that on night of 5th and 6th May, there was a major clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers on the banks of the Pangong Tso Lake in eastern Ladakh.
The lake has often been in the news. Most famously, when back in 2017, during the Doklam standoff, a video of a scuffle between Indian and Chinese soldiers on the banks of this lake went viral.
And the army then issued a statement acknowledging both these incidents and saying, yes, there have been some clashes, but things have now de-escalated and there is no problem. A couple of days later, army chief gave a statement saying, these are isolated incidents and we should not connect them to other larger issues.
And by this time, reports started coming in that there was a major situation developing in eastern Ladakh, in the Pangong Tso Lake, the Galwan Valley area, and the Hot Springs area. After this, a number of official statements were made by diplomats, foreign ministries, and politicians.
So these statements do not reveal much till the time the Defense Minister Rajnath Singh went on television channels last Thursday, and actually said that there were a large number of Chinese soldiers and they had come. So that was the first time the seriousness of the situation was acknowledged.
Here is an excerpt of his interview with Network 18.
हाल फिलहाल की जो घटना है ये बात सच है कि सीमा पर इस समय चीन के लोग भी उनका दावा है कि हमारी सीमा यहां तक है, भारत का यह दावा है कि हमारी सीमा यहां तक है, और उसको लेकर एक मतभेद हुआ है और अच्छी खासी संख्या में चीन के लोग भी आ गए हैं.
Before that, the army had only acknowledged that the patrols had clashed and the things had de-escalated. The foreign ministry statements, as always, were very anodyne. They didn't convey much. But more and more ground reports have come across various newspapers and on various television channels and various other platforms, including in the Indian Express, which give out greater details of what is happening.
This also includes analysis of satellite images that was done by Krishan Kaushik of the Indian Express after speaking to a former commanding officer at Pangong Tso in Ladakh. The images confirm that the Chinese have in fact changed the status quo in the area and have built substantial structures in the region of the LAC.
And the fact to remember here, Shashank, is that the government, which is so keen to deny or rebut any statement, has not denied or rebutted any of these reports which talk about Chinese soldiers being in Indian territory. That itself is a big giveaway to my mind. The fact that there has been no rebuttal or no unequivocal denial by the government saying that the Chinese soldiers are not in Indian territory.
At the center of this entire conflict lies the line of actual control. And to understand the conflict and the tension between the two countries, it is important to understand what this line is and how it came about.
So the line of actual control has a long history which goes pre-partition. As you know, province of Jammu and Kashmir, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir rather, was never a part of British India. It was a part of the British Empire. And its boundaries with Tibet in a Sichuan area of the Ladakh region were never demarcated properly. You may be surprised to know that till 1954, India actually did not show the boundaries marked in either a dotted line or a proper line in the Ladakh sector. It was left as boundary undemarcated. In only 1954, Nehru issued an order, and these maps, which we have all seen in schools, were then produced.
After India gained independence in 1947 and China's revolution took place in 48, the question of where the international boundary lies between the two countries came up. This led to tensions between India and China in the 50s.
And in 1956, the Chinese first proposed something called the line of actual control, which they said, till the time we do not resolve the issue of international boundary, can we actually talk about a line of actual control which goes here?
But Sushant says that India at that time was against the idea of a LAC. India said that it only believed in a sanctified international border. Even when India-China went to war in 1962, the government of India and Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru were against it.
Only in 1993 did India accept the concept of an LAC, when Prime Minister Narasimha Rao went to China and the Chinese Premier and Narasimha Rao signed an agreement. This came in because of the tensions that had started emerging between India and China on the border in the 1980s, after Indian forces started patrolling further and further ahead.
After 1962, Sushant says, Indian forces had actually withdrawn almost 80 to 150 kilometers behind the disputed border. But then in 1975, Indira Gandhi constituted something called the China Study Group, which started saying that the Indian forces should start patrolling further to the borderline. And that's what they did by the 1980s.
And in 86, there was a major incident in Sumdorongshu in Arunachal Pradesh, where the Chinese had come and occupied one of the Indian patrolling points. That standoff lasted for more than a year, and the status quo was restored in 7 years. That incident led to a visit by Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to Beijing. And eventually that led to that we should not have these tensions and we should not have these conflicts. So in 1993, India agreed to a concept called the line of actual control. In the 1993 agreement, it was never mentioned which LAC is this. Is it the LAC of 1962, 1959, 1956, or a new LAC that has been proposed?
Here, both the countries had to sit down and define where the LAC actually lies. But the definition never took place, and the process got stuck after 2002. So now we have a situation where what Indians believe to be their side is not the same as what the Chinese believe to be their side. This is different from the line of control between India and Pakistan, where everything is agreed upon between the two countries. In the case of LAC, India and China don't even agree on its exact distance. India claims that it is 3,488 kilometers, and China believes that it is around 2,000 kilometers.
So essentially, the point to remember is that the line of actual control is a concept. It is not a line. There is no line which both sides agree on. It is just a concept which was agreed upon by India to maintain peace and tranquility on the disputed border. And because the line is not defined properly, delineated on the map, and not mutually agreed upon, it leads to these tensions and these reports which you hear off and on in 2013 in Depsang Plains, in 2014 in Chumar, 2017 Doklam, and even otherwise, a lot of transgressions which we have reported on.
The Chinese are no longer keen on talking about the LAC. When Prime Minister Modi in 2015 had gone to Beijing on an official visit, he had proposed that the process of clarifying the line of actual control should be taken up.
But the Chinese Foreign Ministry told Indian journalists officially on the record saying that we are not keen on clarifying because we believe that it further complicates the process of final resolution or a final boundary settlement. So while India at this point is far more keener on clarifying the LAC so that both sides agree on a line and both militaries do not cross the line, China is no longer keen on the LAC. It really doesn't talk much about the LAC. The last mention by China of LAC is in 2017 during the Doklam crisis, where it mentioned that both sides should adhere to the 1959 LAC in Pangong Tso area.
In this kind of scenario where there is no agreed upon border, the country making the transgression has the upper hand. But Sushant says that it is the difference in power that leads to situations like these.
So I'll give you a hypothetical example, and nothing against Bhutan, but if Bhutan were to try the same thing, Indians would throw the Bhutanese army out. It's essentially the fact that the Chinese can do this and kind of get away with it is due to the fact that they are a powerful country. And Indians are not keen on entering into a military situation, a military conflict with the Chinese. Otherwise, we would have clearly told them that we can throw you out. Look what we did vis-a-vis Pakistan after the terror attack in Anantnag last year. The fact that we bombed Balakot, which is not even in Pakistani-occupied Kashmir, but in proper Pakistan proper, or what happened during surgical strikes in 2017. So a lot of these things have happened. It is essentially a function of the difference of power, even though the aggressor has the element of surprise.
And the transgressions this time did come as a surprise to India. And Sushant explains that there are two reasons for that.
One is some of these areas like Galwan and Hot Spring are settled areas. Settled areas in military terms, local military commanders consider areas where both sides agree where the LAC lies. And these are settled areas, so no transgressions occur. The Chinese would not come here. The fact that the Chinese have come here and amassed a large number of troops in these settled areas, it surprised the Indians. In fact, I should say that the hot spring sector is actually an ITBP sector. It is seen as a low priority sector. It is not manned by the army like the subsector north up there.
The second factor, he says, is that since 2015, the Indian Army had been conducting training exercise in that area. But that did not happen this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
So when the Chinese moved towards the LAC or across the LAC, there were not enough Indian troops available to react quickly. In the campaigning season, the reserves provided by the Brigade of the Reserve Division were not available to India this year, unlike in the last 5 years.
These transgressions have happened previously as well. But this time, they have happened in areas where both sides actually have no disagreement where the LAC lies.
That is one. Number two, they have come at multiple locations. This is not a single location. Number three, the sheer numbers. The fact that they have moved artillery, the fact that they have moved armored, the sheer numbers in which they have come. And number four, what are their demands? Why have they come? Those demands have not been made clear by the Chinese at all. In every other situation, we knew what the Chinese demands were, whether they came in Chumar in 2014 or in Depsang in 2013, or we knew what the Indian demand was in Doklam in 2017. In this case, we do not still know why they have come over such a large frontage, why they have come at so many places, and why they have come in areas which have not been disputed by the two sides.
Experts have been debating about what China's motivations could be, and there have been several possibilities that have been pointed out.
Broadly, the one reason which a lot of Indian officials give on the background briefing is the fact that India is building a lot of infrastructure in the region, and that is worrying the Chinese, and this is a response to the increased Indian infrastructure construction in that area. A lot of international analysts believe that it is part of the larger Chinese assertion, which is taking place both in Hong Kong and in South China Sea, and even otherwise, where the Chinese are trying to assert their position and show that there is power.
There are also military leaders that believe that this could be a tactical maneuver by the Chinese. That is, that they believe that this is their territory, and so they are moving in there. And besides this, there are also those who point to a decision that India took last year.
Another factor which has been raised by many analysts is the fact that India changed the status of Ladakh on August 5th when it converted it into a union territory along with Jammu and Kashmir after the revocation of Article 370. You would remember that the Chinese Foreign Ministry had issued a very strong statement then saying that this alters everything. And many people believe that Chinese have responded to that change now by saying that India has altered the status of a disputed area and therefore they are now asserting their claim. It is not very clear as to which of these factors is at play and what percentage each of these factors is playing here. These are all, to my mind, educated guesses, so to say.
Despite tensions escalating, it is worth noting that no firing has taken place between the two countries.
In fact, no round has been fired in anger on the India-China border since 1967, when those situation took place at Nathula. Since then, no round has been fired in anger. Even no round was fired now. But there have been instances of brawls and physical clashes where the Chinese came in with bats with nails and baseball bats, etc. And there was a lot of injuries on both sides. The Indians also retaliated and there have been a lot of injuries. So, we have gone back to stones and sticks from an era of nuclear weapons or whatever you want to say. Yeah.
To de-escalate the tensions, a marathon meeting of over 6 hours took place on Saturday between the Indian and Chinese army commanders in a place called Moldo, across the LAC on the Chinese side. And we spoke to Shubhajit Roy, who reports on matters of foreign affairs for the Indian Express, about this meet.
The basic thrust of the meeting from the Indian perspective was to get the troops back to their positions as it existed in April. So the Indian side is basically making this demand that restore status quo ante. Status quo ante means that you restore where things were before.
Shubhajit points out that if you unpack this demand, it would involve the Chinese troops going back to their original positions.
So that they don't block Indian patrols, which go up to the Indian perception of the line of actual control, and also so that India is able to carry out with its construction activities in upgrading its infrastructure on its side of the border. And as we learned that the Indian side made the point that the aggressive behavior by the Chinese side should be dialed down so that there is peace and tranquility along the border.
In the past, when such transgressions have taken place, they have been primarily resolved through diplomacy. Military talks have only had a very limited role.
So whenever such a standoff takes place, whether it happened in 2013 in Depsang or at Chumar in 2014 and again at Doklam in 2017, in all these three cases in the past that we know of, the situation was resolved only after diplomatic negotiations. And this usually happens both at the field level, where military to military diplomatic negotiations take place, and there are negotiations that take place between diplomats in the two capitals, which take place between the two sides. So, if you remember, in Depsang in 2013, the standoff continued for 3 weeks. In Chumar also, it took a couple of weeks. And in Doklam, it went on for almost 10 weeks. I mean, 2.5 months.
Diplomatic talks are slow and gradual, but it is only after such talks, Shubhajit says, that both sides come to a resolution.
So that's how it has worked in the past. And the effort right now is it should be handled exactly the same way, because that's what the two leaders, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, both had agreed at the two informal summits that had taken place. That when they had said that the armies, the militaries of the two sides should try and maintain peace and tranquility along the border.
The current situation has brought to focus India-China relations once again. The ties between the two countries seem to have been strengthening in the recent past. After Prime Minister Modi visited Wuhan in 2018, there was a lot of talk about the Wuhan spirit. And President Xi Jinping's visit to India last year was also very well received. But the current tensions seem to be in contrast to all of that. So does that mean that all those diplomatic efforts had no bearing on the dispute between the armies of the two countries? Shubhajit says that over the years, the two countries have actually learned to keep the two separate.
A conscious effort has been taken the last 10, 15 years at least, that the border dispute, which has been a long-standing dispute for the last 70 years, should not impact other parts of the relationship, whether it's economic, whether it's cultural, whether it's people to people, whether it's any other relationship, any other sphere of the relationship.
And this is the reason he says that the two countries manage to have almost $100 billion trade every year.
Similarly, the kind of soft power exchange that happens, whether you call it yoga or you call it movies like Three Idiots being shown there, or you have more Chinese tourists traveling to India or Indian students going to China to study medicine especially. So you have these exchanges, and they should not be impacted by the ongoing border dispute or any tension that happens along the line of actual control.
Shubhajit says that keeping the border dispute separate from the economic and cultural relationship has been one of the biggest achievements of successive governments.
Whether it's been the Congress-led UPA or the BJP-led NDA government. And that's how it has so far worked out, although both have competing interests internationally, whether you see the Indian opposition to the Belt and Road Initiative or the Chinese opposition to India's aspiration to become a member of the Nuclear Suppliers Group or at the UN Security Council. Despite all these differences, there has been an effort diplomatically that both sides should have a thriving economic relationship, because that is how the future has been envisaged as seen by both leaderships across parties in India at least.
The other threat to emerge from this situation has been the one with the United States. Late last month, when reports started coming about these tensions, President Trump announced that he had spoken to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who he claimed was not in a good mood about what's going on with China.
They have a big conflict going with India and China. two countries with 1.4 billion people, two countries with very powerful militaries. And India's not happy, and probably China's not happy. But I can tell you, I did speak to Prime Minister Modi. He's not in a good mood about what's going on with China.
Trump had also offered to mediate between the two countries. The Indian government sources had denied these claims and said that the two countries will resolve the issues bilaterally. But a few days after this happened, on the 2nd of June, Trump and Modi did talk about the tensions between India and China.
Now, this is very unusual because at least in the last 20 years, we have not seen the Indian Prime Minister talking to the US President on an India-China border issue and then declaring it publicly, making it public. They may have had conversations in the past, we don't know, but there's been never an acknowledgement that this has been discussed in the past. So this was kind of a new thing and an unusual thing that we saw this time when Prime Minister Modi spoke to US President Trump.
Now, US and China are considered rivals. The current administration of both countries have clashed on a number of issues.
From Taiwan to Hong Kong to South China Sea to trade war, you've seen a number of issues where the two administrations have clashed. So India is obviously sort of caught in between and is trying to deftly balance the two relationships without sort of undermining each other.
India has shared interests with the US, but at the same time, China is its neighbor and a major trading partner.
Therefore, it's difficult for India to sort of do US's bidding in that sense. So India is trying to sort of play a balancing act in the short term and the medium term. We have to see how this plays out, whether this particular situation escalates. The efforts are to diffuse and de-escalate the situation as of now by both sides.
The diplomatic talks are on the way, and it appears that India will be in a long haul with China over this.
We don't know yet whether political leaders will talk to each other as of now, but there is a possibility that there could be some political overtures as well that could be made at the foreign minister's level or at the national security advisor's level. But so far, we know that the talks will continue at the diplomat level as well as the military level.
But if these talks prolong for a long period, then the army too will have to be deployed in the region for a long time. And the region where these tensions are taking place itself will pose a lot of challenges for the force.
The biggest challenge comes from the high altitude.
That's Sushant again.
So these are around 14,000 to 16,000 feet. And you would need around 14 days of acclimatization before you can actually move in. So if you go from Delhi to Ladakh, to these areas, to Galwan or to Hot Spring, you would need an acclimatization schedule of around 14 days before you can actually start being deployed there. That is one, the high altitude and the time required to be deployed. Number two is the very low temperatures combined with a very high wind chill factor. While the temperatures may only go up to zero, but there are very strong winds which actually make you feel colder than what you would feel. It's almost like a cold desert, as they say.
And the third challenge is that of the terrain, which is extremely harsh.
It is mountainous, crisscrossed with nalas, crisscrossed with rivers, rivulets. There is very poor infrastructure. So you will have very few roads, you will have very few tracks through which you can easily mobilize or go anywhere. This brings a huge amount of military challenges to any deployment. And these are not inhabited areas in that sense. There are areas over 100 kilometers where there is no village. So in this situation, any military deployment with its logistics, supply chain, and other operational requirements becomes a huge challenge for any country to sustain.
And it is in these tough terrains that preparations will now start.
Preparations in terms of habitat, in terms of logistics, in terms of supplies, all those preparations they will have to start making because winters will set in Ladakh in October. It is around October that winter starts setting in, and it's a very harsh winter. And soldiers cannot be out in the open or in tents any longer. And that is the one thing which the army will have to prepare for.
And the other point is that the army will have to increase its vigil in all those areas along the LAC where Chinese soldiers have ingressed. the areas which are seen as settled territory.
And that would mean that its troops will have to be deployed further forward. It would also mean that they will have to be on a higher alert. It would again mean then there is the issues of logistics and operational supports would come in. It would stretch the army more than it would have been stretched otherwise. Also considering the fact that the line of control with Pakistan has been more active this year than it has been any year since 2003, when the ceasefire was instituted there. So militancy in Kashmir has also gone up. As you saw, 9 militants were killed yesterday by the security forces. So with the commitments in Kashmir and in the line of control, these increased commitments of the line of actual control with China during the harsh winter months over an extended period are going to strain the Indian army or push it to the limit, so to say.
Right now, as we discussed earlier, the status quo has been altered. In Pagongso, a large number of tents have come up. The Chinese soldiers are sitting on what they perceive to be their line of control, and the Indian soldiers, Sushant says, are not allowed to go to the point which they believe to be their line of control.
In another place called Galwan Valley, it is believed that the large number of Chinese soldiers and military equipment is amassed on the other side of the LAC, on their side of the LAC, including heavy armor and artillery guns, which have Indian military posts in their radar in their target range. The third place in Hot Spring, there are conflicting reports, but it is believed that the Chinese have ingressed to some extent on the Indian side of the LAC, and there are significant amount of troops deployed.
And India has also deployed a large number of troops, artillery guns, and armored tanks.
And the number of soldiers that the Indians may have, or the equipment that the Indians may have, might be greater than what the Chinese have. And that is primarily for the reason that the Chinese have better infrastructure, so they can move troops very quickly and interchange troops very quickly. India, in comparison, has poorer infrastructure, so it requires larger number of troops to achieve the same military effectiveness in the area.
Now the question is, with tensions rising and with India being unsure of China's motives, how worried should one be?
Because the talks are happening between India and China, both militarily and diplomatically, as has been acknowledged by both the sides, I think the probability of it escalating into a physical war or a kinetic conflict looks rather low to me at this point in time. You do not know how the situation will emerge. And very clearly, Indians are not keen on getting into a war at this point in time with the Chinese. But what we should be worried about is that the status quo that has been altered, how do we ensure that the status quo ante is restored as of April? How do the Chinese go back from the areas that they have come in? What measures can India take to ensure that the Chinese go back? What kind of leverages does the government of India have to ensure that the Chinese do not stay in the areas where they have come in and stay? Because this would mean that they could do it anywhere else tomorrow. If it was accepted today, they could do it anywhere else tomorrow. And I think that is the big worry. The big worry is not this escalating into a war. The big worry is how, without firing around, how, without getting into any kind of kinetic conflict, you do not allow the Chinese to arm twist you into giving certain territory.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show, as always, was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.